Hey budget gardeners, Vita Loca here. Join me today as I show you how to winter sow. So let's go. The best time to start your winter sowing process is after the winter solstice. And we are past that date. So you can winter sow anytime after that. And I typically like to start my winter sowing process planting perennials. Perennials typically need a long time when it comes to a cold, moist stratification period. So you want to make sure that your perennial seeds are getting that. Did I mention what's wonderful about the winter sowing process is that it saves you the money of having to buy indoor grow lights. If you don't have them, don't worry about it. You can still grow seeds and have them planted outside. And if you do have grow lights like I do, you can see them right behind me. I like to save my indoor grow lights for annuals and vegetables. For perennial seeds, I really like to grow most of my perennial seeds outdoors. And I've been very successful with the winter sowing process. And I've made some modifications over the years. But for the most part, the process works well for me, which is why I want to share that process with you. When you think about it, when you have a perennial in your yard and it drops its seeds, many times in the spring, you'll find the little seedlings have sprouted of that plant at the base of the plant where the seeds dropped. Well, that's basically what winter sowing is. We're mimicking the same type of process. However, we have a little bit more control because we're putting the seeds in a container and we're letting the little seedlings grow in that container. And then we can grow the plants on and move them around our yard wherever we want to. I like to grow a lot of perennials from seed. Part of the reason is I want to fill my whole yard with lots of perennials. Also, I have a backyard plant nursery and I like to sell my perennials. So rather than just keep dividing on the perennials that are in my landscape, I also can winter sow many of the plants and put them right out in the plant nursery for sale. I've made a bunch of videos showing you how to collect your own seeds from different annuals as well as perennials. So many of the perennials that I'm starting from seed were from seeds that I collected myself. So even though I'm starting all my perennials right now, I also plan on starting some cold weather crops like lettuce and carrots. I also plan on starting some annuals using this process, but it's still too early for those plants because there are nights when it's really cold and freezing. So I don't want to start those plants too early, which is why I'm focused on the perennials for right now. And the important thing to keep in mind when you're planting perennials from seed is you want to plant perennials that are hardy in your zone. So make sure you always do your research and read the back of the seed package label or look it up on the internet because it would be a shame to plant perennial seeds and find out they're not hardy in your zone. So one of the things that you need is you need a container that allows light to come in. It's going to act basically as a mini greenhouse. I've had a lot of luck using just regular 1 gallon milk jugs. I've experimented in the past. I've used small takeout containers and small juice bottles. And my experience has been either the containers have not been tall enough, and sometimes as the plants are growing in the container, they're bumping up to the top of the container. So I like to make sure I'm picking a taller container. And also, my experience with some of my other containers I've chosen in the past is that the containers were not big enough. And I feel like this size container is perfect for me. And also, we drink a lot of milk. I've been saving these containers for almost a whole year, so I have many bags of these containers saved up. I also like to reuse them from year after year. So I have many brand new milk jug bottles, but then I also have some that I'm going to be reusing from last year. So when it comes to your mini greenhouse, what you want to do is, in the case of this milk jug, you basically are trying to cut a line, not all the way around, but I would say probably 80% of the way around. And you want to make sure you don't cut all the way around because the handle will hold the top to the bottom of the container. And I'll show you my process for cutting through this. And I have these shears and they've been working well for me. I really like them. They cut very easily through the milk jugs as well as for making holes in the milk jugs. So what I do is when I'm cutting, I want to make sure I'm leaving at least 4 inches in the bottom. when you're putting your potting soil in whatever container you choose, you want to make sure you have at least 4 inches depth in that container. So I'm just going to cut right here, just a small piece. And now what I can do is go ahead and cut my milk jug. There's been times when I didn't leave 4 inches of soil in the bottom, and I found that it definitely is better to make. I would rather cut closer to the top and leave a larger amount on the bottom. And now you can see that the handle acts as a hinge, and in the spring there will be days when I just need to open this up more, just to let more air circulation. And also, you don't want your greenhouse to get too hot in the springtime. So the next thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to cut drainage holes in the bottom of my container. And there are different ways that you can make the drainage holes in the bottom. So be creative with that. But again, these shears work well for me. And I like to make a good amount of holes. I want to make sure that there's good drainage here. And even though I don't have any holes in the center, my experience has been that this type of container still drains very well, as long as I make enough holes in the perimeter here. And you want to make sure that you have some sort of slits or openings in whatever container you choose. And the reason for that is so that rain or snow gets into this container and naturally waters whatever's in your container. But my experience has been that this is not enough. I also like to add additional slits in the top of my container, just so that when the water is coming in, it's reaching the whole entire inside of this container, not just the center part. Okay, so now the next thing is we want to fill this up with soil. You don't want to use a seed starting mix because it's too light and too fluffy. It will dry out way too quickly. So you can use some sort of a potting mix that you buy, or you can make your own potting mix. I like to make my own potting mix because I have a ton of these milk jugs that I will be winter sowing with, and it would get very expensive if I was to buy my own potting mix. And the recipe that I use is 1 part peat moss to 1 part perlite. The peat moss retains the water and the perlite helps drain the water. And if you don't want to use peat moss, you could also use cocoa coir. And again, it would be 1 part cocoa coir to 1 part perlite. And in this bucket here is the potting mix that I've made. And I'm just going to go ahead and pour the potting mix into my container. And I would say that's good. I'm just pressing down to get out any air pockets that might be in here. And the seeds that we're going to sow together are an echinacea, and they're a short type of echinacea. The blossom is pink color, and I collected these seeds in this past year, 2023. And there are a ton of seeds in this packet. And so I don't plan on putting all of these seeds in here, but I'll do a fair amount. Now, when it comes to how many seeds to put in your container, that's really up to you. Personally, I like to put a ton of seeds inside of my containers, and then I thin out the plants as they're getting bigger. But I know some people prefer to only put 2, 3, 4 seeds in their containers. I like to put the seeds in very heavily because, again, I plan on transplanting all the little seedlings when they're very small out of this container. My experience with perennials has been that they typically need light to germinate. Again, when they're out in nature and the plants drop their seeds, no one's out there planting the seeds in the ground. They're just dropping to the ground and germinating on their own. And so I'm basically mimicking what happens out in nature. I'm not going to put any additional potting mix on top of these seeds. I mean, I probably have at least 30 or 40 seeds that I'm putting in this container, but I don't count. I just spread them in there. And the next thing that I like to do is now press down on the seeds with the potting mix. And that just ensures that there's good soil to seed contact. This next step is optional, but I like to add a plant tag or a plant label inside of my container because sometimes what happens is when you label the outside of your containers, the marker wears off and then you don't know what's inside all of your containers or milk jugs. So it's always a good idea to just take that extra step and add a label into and put it inside of your container. So I'm just going to put on here echinacea short pink. And I'm just going to place this in the container. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to add some water to this. Even though this will be going outside, and actually today's a rainy day, you still want to make sure that you saturate this and put water in here just to give these seeds a good jump start. So what I like to use when I'm watering these milk jugs indoors is I like to just use a hand sprayer. And so I'm going to go ahead and generously add water to this milk jug. Okay, so that's a good amount of water that I've added. And the next step is to seal this container closed. And I like to use duct tape. It works out really well, and on a very windy, snowy, rainy day, the duct tape still stays on my containers. When I first started winter sowing, I used to put duct tape all the way around my container, and I found that to be very wasteful. So I actually usually only put 2, maybe 3 pieces of the duct tape, and I found that that still holds my container shut. And now that I've added some duct tape to my container, the next thing that I want to do is I want to label the milk jug on the outside. I like to use a garden marker. That works really well. I used to use Sharpies and I found that the Sharpies would wear out and the garden markers don't seem to. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to label the seed that we just planted as well as the date. A lot of times I like to label it on both sides, this side as well as the other side, because when I'm outside and I have 60 or 80 milk jugs, it just makes it easier if I have it on both sides. So I'm just going to label it on this side as well. And that's it. Other than that, this is going to get placed outside. Now, when I place it outside, I've learned over the last few years of places that work for me and places that don't work for me. The first year that I winter sowed, I placed all the containers that I had on the north side of my house, and I placed them under the eaves. My lesson that I learned when I placed all these on the north side was it was very shady. It didn't get much sun. And so the seedlings took forever to sprout. Also, the other thing I learned was because not all the jugs, but some of the jugs were under the eaves, they weren't getting the appropriate amount of water, snow that they needed. So the next year, what I did was I switched it and I put all my milk jugs in containers on the south side of my house. That worked out much better. But even then, I learned that some of the containers were still under the eaves. Not all of them, but a few of them. So this year, I found a great place where I'm going to place all my containers, and they're going to be on the south side, but they're not going to be under any eaves. When they're under the eaves, they either don't get any rain or snow, or sometimes when the water's coming down, like it's raining very heavy out, there's like too much water coming into this container. So be mindful of that when you're placing your containers outside. If you haven't already subscribed, please click the subscribe button because it's free to you. And also you want to hit the notification bell because you'll be notified when I give you updates. And the biggest thing is when I do a winter sowing reveal, it's like Christmas, opening up each of these containers and showing you how we did with planting all the different perennials or annuals or vegetables inside of the milk jugs. And then also I'll show you my next steps on what I do with the plants when it comes to transplanting them out. Okay, so let's go outside and I'm going to show you where all my winter sowing milk jugs are going to go for this winter. We have had an unusually warm winter. I live in New Hampshire, zone 5B, and normally by now the ground would be totally frozen. I would be totally dressed up in winter gear and there would be snow on the ground. None of that's happening yet, and that's okay by me. these perennials will still be fine. And I plan on filling up this whole area and the whole area behind me with milk jugs. So something to keep in mind when you're doing this is if you put your milk jugs in an area where it's going to get too windy, then you might need to corral them somehow. You don't want the jugs to be flying around in the wind. And also, some people might view this as an eyesore, so you want to place them where you feel comfortable in your yard. I don't mind that these are placed in an area where anyone's going to see them when they're entering my house. I'm okay with that. But those are just some little things to keep in mind. But I want to know if you have ever winter sowed and how have you done? Please leave a comment below. I'd love to hear from you and share your experience, maybe with what containers have worked for you, what containers have not worked for you. I'd love to hear from you. But I still have a ton of perennials to plant, probably somewhere in the ballpark of 50 or 60, maybe more. I haven't counted. So I will definitely be giving you updates on those plants as the season progresses. But until the next video, make it a great day with gardening.